Chapter 3 The Master. Jacen was seated with his back to a tree within the great forest that surrounded their farm. His master sat 6 feet away upon an old stump of tree and guided the visual exercise from his vantage point. "Excellent. Now quiet your mind and seek the secret doorway through your inner eye," came the man's voice. As Jacen closed his eyes and struggled to maintain the careful focus his master had taught him, he would suddenly become distracted. Every time he almost reached the point where he was no longer aware of his own thoughts and would approach the lip of the doorway within his mind, one of the whispers would begin to speak in his mind, and it would draw his attention away from the exercise. After several moments of trying, Jacen shouted an epithet and jumped to his feet in frustration. The master wore a small smile upon his mouth and stood up and stretched his torso. Gently, Jacen. You will find the place. It just takes practice, as in all things," he said. Jacen was momentarily soothed by his master's words, then heard one of the whispers laughing in his mind, which caused him to fly into a moment of rage. The young man screamed a battle cry and began attacking a dying tree that stood nearby with crackling limbs. His blows soon caused the tree to snap apart into pieces. Just then a firm hand was upon his shoulder, and he heard his master's voice as if it were coming through a dense fog. He could not make out what the other man was saying, and in a sudden frustration, he felt his rage flare up once again. The whispers of laughter continued, and caught in a rage, Jacen swung around and pushed his master's hand off his shoulder and made to strike the other man. Suddenly, the other man was not standing in front of him, and Jacen felt a sharp blow push him from behind. He was pushed forward several feet and spun around with a snarl. "Jacen, stop!" The power of his master's command blasted into him, and it was like being splashed in the face with ice-cold water. He reeled back, then recovered and took several deep breaths. The whispers had died away, and Jacen shook his head to clear it. After a moment, he looked up at his master, who stood nearby with a small amount of tension within his usual relaxed frame. "Master, I am so sorry. I don't know what came over me," he said by way of apology. The master relaxed, and his usual compassionate disposition returned as if it had never left. "No worries, Jacen. We all can lose ourselves in the heat of conflict. Tell me, what is the primary mental discipline I have taught you?" the lightly glowing man asked. Jacen quickly thought about the many mental disciplines and pulled the primary philosophy to the front of his memory. He stood up straight and faced his master. "Do not allow anything to disrupt one's focus," came his response. His master responded, "That's correct, and it includes, of course, one's own emotions. Tell me, do you think this is good advice?" Jacen was taken aback, as the man had never asked him what he thought about any of the disciplines. He composed himself and thought about an appropriate answer. Finally, after several moments had passed, he said in response, "It makes sense to me that if one is able to maintain their focus at all times, there will be the most efficient use of one's resources." "That is a very proactive thought," said the master. "Now, in this situation, what can you do to try to better reach the astral plane within your mind?" his master asked. Jacen thought again for another moment, then said, "If I don't succeed at it the first time, examine what is not working and try a different approach. In all things, be secure that an answer will be found if I look for it." The master smiled as he said this and gently nodded. He lightly bowed his head to the boy, then began strolling away toward the farm. "Continue your practice for a time, then join me for the afternoon chores," his master commanded as he strolled away. Jacen sat back down with his back against the tree and began practicing the technique his master had taught him. He had never broken through to the astral plane and wanted to master the technique. Sadly, the ethereal dimension continued to elude him. He closed his eyes and instantly became aware of the usual sounds of birdsong within the trees, and would occasionally hear the movements of the small creatures within the nearby forest. As usual, the whispers became prominent in his mind, and several sought dominance in the forefront of his mental thoughts. "Young warrior, learn of my fighting technique and you will be unstoppable," came one whisper. "The master is wrong, and you will die if you listen to him," came another. "Be quiet!" he shouted. Instantly all the whispers subsided, and his mind was momentarily cleared of thoughts and sensations. He took a deep breath, then with eyes closed he concentrated on the rhythm of his breathing. After several minutes, his breathing began to slow, and his awareness began to reveal a doorway within his mind. The outline of the door could be made out in the dark of his field of vision. It was the general shape of an egg, with a moving pattern of multicolored, interlocking shapes subtly cascading toward him. Jacen quietly registered a moment of excitement as he knew he had reached the periphery of breakthrough. Just then, one of the whispers interrupted his flow of thought and almost seemed to shout within his mind, "Seek the Master's journal and you will find a shortcut." The relative noise of the whisper broke his concentration, and with a curse, Jacen stood up and stretched his back. The whispering had turned into a mocking laughter, but Jacen was nonetheless intrigued at the suggestion that had come from the voice. He had never considered taking the journal away from his master. The man had always kept its contents hidden from him, and when Jacen had asked about it, the master had simply said, "Some things are private and not for the thoughts of other people." With that, he would walk to his room and put the journal away. Jacen walked quickly back toward the cabin and hid from view at the tree line that overlooked the property. After several minutes, he noticed his master pruning trees out within the far orchard, and he made his way into their cabin. The small building was darker inside than outside, and Jacen felt his heartbeat in his throat as he moved to do something against his master's wishes for the first time in his life. He opened the door to his master's room and looked around the Spartan area. There was a small cot in one corner that was separated by a large storage trunk and a simple desk with paper and writing materials. Jacen approached the trunk and noticed it had no lock. He lifted the trunk open, and his eyes saw several mechanical items he did not recognize. On top of one group of items stood the old journal, and with trembling hands, Jacen grabbed the large tome, shut the trunk, and took the book quickly back to his own room. He sat upon his own cot and opened it and shuffled through the pages, immediately noticing several markings, drawings, and geometrical scripts that he did not comprehend. His eyes fell across some writings in the standard script his master had taught him, and he began reading an old journal note entry. He had been reading for several minutes when he heard a creaking noise and looked up with a startled expression on his face. Standing in the doorway to his room was the master, who looked at the journal within Jacen's hands, then back up to Jacen's eyes. Jacen noticed an expression on his master's face that he had never seen before, one that he immediately identified as disappointment. "Jacen, I've told you before, some things are private and not meant for other people," his master said in a quiet voice, and he moved into the small room to gently take the book out of the young man's hands. Jacen stood up and looked at the floor. "Master, he began, but his master interrupted him and said, "It is natural to be curious, but it is also a worthwhile refinement to respect another's privacy. Think about that as you move about your chores." The man left the small room with his journal in hand, and after a moment, Jacen heard him leave the small cabin.